All right, thanks for coming out. My name's TJ, or Anthony Maltese. I came in here from the Woodland Park, Colorado, the Dinosaur Resource Center. I'm a commercial paleontologist, collector. My main job is to go out, find the localities of specimens all across the western United States, excavate them, bring them back, and basically see that they go to either an institution or a private collector, depending on what kind of specimen they are, if they're significant or not. Basically following SVP sort of bylaws on that, where if it is a scientifically important specimen, it stays in the public trust. So, of course, we all know early paleontology and its connection to commercial paleontology. Mary Anning, you know, a lot of people respect her. There's even some Twitter feeds for Mary Anning's revenge for females in paleontology. However, she was never, you know, allowed to have a position in a museum or any sort of geological society at that time, although people were happy to buy her fossils that she was so good at finding. The bone wars in Western North America with Cope and Marsh, all that fun stuff that went along. That was actually a blessing in disguise, while sometimes their methods are a little frowned upon. We ended up with people like Samuel Williston, John Bell Hatcher, Benjamin Mudge, a lot of these early paleontologists that formed a lot of the early paleo programs across the US and went across the world finding many of our fossils. And of course the Sternbergs, and I'm glad to see this. I misspelled that on my earlier draft, and so I'm glad that the new draft came up. Who started again in Western North America in the United States, ended up going up to Canada, working on fossils, sending them back to the American Museum of Natural History. Once that was no longer allowed, many of them worked for the Geological Survey of Canada, and I believe Charles M. Sternberg is still buried up in Ottawa, Canada, finishing his career up there, working for the museum there. And our crew even is out there in western Kansas. This spot over here is a mosasaur I found a few years ago, but working on this property, we actually, about 200 yards away, meters, I guess. Sorry, non-SI units are being used in this talk. 200 yards away from here, we rediscovered the holotype site for Cope's protostega, discovered from 1871, which he did not document very well, but we're pretty confident that we found that there. So we're working in the same areas. Private versus public land and legislation. In the United States, we don't work on government land at all. So there's especially in the West, there's a whole intermixing of private land, public land, don't work on BLM land, especially after the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act a few years ago. We compensate our landowners, much like mineral rights, so that when a specimen goes to another museum, they're financially compensated for that. I need a cheat sheet. So, but what we're saying here is that land ownership laws and property ownership laws need to be obeyed by people, collectors. There's a lot of animosity out there between commercial and academics and people like Brian Switek, who is neither. He's an amateur that basically rehashes other people's work for most of his writings. Now, he's gone on in this extremist bent over here. That his basic idea is that fossils are valueless but priceless at the same time, and so therefore no private ownership of fossils should be done and no sale should ever be done whatsoever. I've kind of put that off as one extreme. Now, there's a lot of other people out there that think that, you know, you can't tell, especially in the United States, you know, a lot of Trump supporters out there, unfortunately. But they say, you can't tell me what to do, this is my property, I can do whatever with it I want. If I want to make it into, you know, flooring, that's a possibility too. I think that there's a middle ground that needs to be reached on this though. So, another one that came out, this was published by Phil Curry, Eric Scott, Stuart Sumida, and Kenshu Shimada, who is a co-author with myself and Jeff Liston on a couple of specimens too, so it's kind of strange that Kenshu came out with this. But since they saw fit to publish it, we should probably look at some of the three main points that they made. So, this is what they say in this one. So, we're going back to the Tarbosaurus there. Sounds pretty crappy. This right here is not Tarbosaurus. This is a Daspletosaurus that we excavated about 10 years ago, and it's taken us that long to actually prepare the specimen. The bone was like rotten wood, like an old log out in the forest. Took a lot of materials, took a lot of our time to do that, and so one of the reasons why there's a price to these fossils is because you're paying for this kind of thing, not just that we think that this is beautiful and it has pointy teeth, so it must be worth a fortune. That's not what we say. But if it wasn't for commercial paleo people doing this, most institutions in the United States did not have the capability to properly excavate and preserve the specimen. So we do come in handy sometimes for this kind of thing. Well, nobody should condone poaching, ever. Their first basic thing is non-commercial paleontology. In the most basic sense, commercial, it could be commercial, whereas you're working with fossils, you're getting paid for it, but in academia, that also holds true, so you have to be careful with that. So what I'm showing over here, this looks like a trash bag. It was a very hot day. Parked over by an outcrop looking for a little time to cool off in the truck and the air conditioning, and we're wondering why there was plastic in there. It turns out that even on our property that we lease specifically and exclusively from landowners, there are still poachers out there that come out, look for fossils, find them, try to grab them out of the ground. If we hadn't been there that day, basically, somebody else would have come by, ripped it out of the ground, there'd be no record of that fossil ever existing. So, shouldn't be acceptable, but it's still done. Phil Curry, one of the co-authors there, had Francois on the Dinochirus description. He then was shortly thereafter busted for trying to import a Tarbosaurus specimen for about 40,000 euros. And it was seized, went to the local museum near where he lives in France. I'm not saying that Phil Curry knew that this was going on, definitely not, but his ethics did not transfer over to the people that he sought to publish these descriptions with. Humboldt Museum, don't mean to be picking on anybody, but Tristanato project is brokered by Terry Kitka, or Zeka, however you want to say that. And he was convicted of smuggling Burgess Shale fossils out of Canada several years ago, and still people will work with people with kind of loosey-goosey sort of morals on this. The second one that they were talking about was this House bill in Montana. Basically, we're getting into real red state conservative politics with this one. Again, not really commercial. They're just politicians who we know sometimes don't make the best informed decisions, trying to find some money for their state. In their last one, they didn't mention specifically which museum it was, but it was the San Diego Natural History Museum. Tried to get a historical Sternberg collection deaccessioned. They put it on the auction block immediately. Now, this would probably have to go through the board of directors and the collection staff and the curatorial staff in order to get approved. And when this came out, many of you were at SVP in Los Angeles that year. And there was a bit of an uproar from that as well. It turns out that the dinosaur material went back to Canada, was repatriated, which is probably pretty good. And the marine animal stuff went to a museum in Kansas, the Prairie Fire Museum, which is an arm of the American Museum of Natural History. So, and I don't believe that any money changed hands on that, but again, it's hard to say. It wasn't really out in the open, which I think was part of the problem too. It was sort of a backroom type of deal thing, and not a lot of people know the specifics of it. So, why not work cooperatively? We tried to do that whenever possible. Interesting story here. This is a specimen of a small protostega that went to the Fort Hays State Museum. This lady right over here was a grad student at the time who decided not to pay attention to boundaries or fences or anything, hopped over the fence, found part of this specimen, and then started removing it without getting permission from the landowners. And, well, I mean, technically that's poaching, Shouldn't do that. We got the specimen donated to the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, though. You can see Mike Everhart there up in the upper right corner from the Oceans of Kansas thing. We went out there because it was a fairly large specimen. They didn't have the capability of working on specimens that big, so we dug it up, brought it back to with documentation, brought it back to the museum, prepared it, molded the individual elements, restored it, made restored cast of it that gets sold across the world, And the original specimen was always in trust with the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. So we didn't get anything from selling fossils or anything like that, but you know, that works. Commercial collectors don't collect data. I think Kirby's talk showed a lot of the mapping that happens with some of these commercial collectors or non-academic collectors. We realize that data is important to the specimen and adds value to the specimen. So if you don't collect data with your specimen, whether you're an academic or a commercial collector, you probably shouldn't be collecting specimens. So with that, it's worthless. We have field maps from the Palaeontology site that we're working on. We have field inventories that go along with it. We have strat sections that we do with it so that we can show that this Palaeontologus was actually in a crevasse blade deposit. We know the depositional environment. We know where it is in time. With Kansas specimens, we always record where it is in the section relative to the nearest marker units because, again, we have problems with historical collections that didn't have that sort of data and trying to match it up with the biostratigraphy. Here we are not collecting data from the Avaceratops site that we just finished a few years ago. Again, photo mapping, measuring, careful excavation, all that fun stuff. So I think that people really need to be able to make a distinction. This is a very blurry picture, I'm sorry, of us working with another sauropod specimen. This is a historical one found by Hatcher in 1900, went to the Carnegie Museum, went back to the University of Wyoming a few years later. Mounted in a very old, well, 1950s pose, had many layers of reconstruction on it. The entire thing was painted with lead-based black paint. And we were brought on here and we were able to disassemble the thing, clean it off, find original field markings on there using our coating removal techniques. And we molded and cast it. In this case, the sacrum was very high off the ground, you know, probably about 5 meters up. And we weren't able to take it down, so we even have the capabilities to be able to get stuff up in the air, make peel molds, and then restore the specimen from there. But it's all very well controlled, very well documented, so that all this information stays in the public trust. One thing we have to remember too as commercial paleontologists is not all fossils have commercial value. There are a lot of things out there that are really cool, really, really rare, but you know, what am I going to do with a cruddy impression of a heteromorph ammonite from the chalk? You know, it has no commercial value. People sell ammonites by the truckloads, I think we've seen in some of these other photographs. But it turns out this is the first heteromorph ammonite ever discovered from the Smoky Hill chalk, period. And so what we're able to do is, you know, if certain things do have a high scientific value, if you cultivate the dealers, a lot of times they will be donated to these museums so that they may be worked on and kept them in the public trust as well. We've done this hundreds of times with many specimens, you know, donating 2 of the 3 Saurocephalus predentary bones that the Sternberg Museum has in their collection. You know, an isolated predentary does us no good, but if somebody else has a use for it, we're more than happy to provide specimens for this kind of stuff. So, what I'm proposing right here is, it may be a little bit out on the limb, but there should be at least, for academics and commercial collectors alike, there should be some minimum collection standards. Permission for excavating the site. You know, don't hop fences, don't yank stuff out of Mongolia without permits or anything. It seems pretty basic, but you know, a lot of people don't do this. Qualified or supervised excavation. In the United States, we're really dependent with our museums on having volunteer workforces come out and help us. A lot of them are not very well trained, and the volunteers end up doing a lot of damage to some of these fossils too. And even if there are 1 or 2 paleontologists out there on the site, qualified paleontologists, you can't babysit everybody all the time. But having a training program so that people know what the heck they're doing is important. Field data collection. Again, I've worked at the University of Kansas for 7 years before coming to tribal paleontology, and in that sort of realm, I did see a lot of crappy field work, crappy data collection, no strat stuff being done, no photographs of sites being taken, especially on large animals. It's there's not really an excuse for that now. Qualified preparation staff. A lot of times prep staff is an avocational type thing where you have volunteers that work there, or you have somebody that will train one person. You can trace your lineage that way. sometimes, but when you, again, bring it back to the lab and you have 20, 30 people that don't really know what they're doing, working on important specimens, you can lose a lot of data and have specimens destroyed by that. Again, you shouldn't, as a commercial collector, we shouldn't be hiring the same people that should be dropping fries at McDonald's a lot of times to work on fossils. Make sure you have data collection when you prepare the specimens, of course. So you know what materials were used on it, who worked on it, what it did look like before preparation and afterwards. Keeping ancillary fossils with the specimen. The shed teeth, the guard bits, the turtles that go along with dinosaurs are all really important too. And that should remain with it, and a lot of times that stuff gets split up. And then access to specimens again. Not only in academia, where we've all heard horror stories about somebody having a specimen in their drawer for 20 years and they've called dibs on it and nobody's allowed to work on it. That doesn't help the science at all. But not only in commercial paleontology of allowing people into your commercial collections or private collections in order to look at things, but there are a lot of academic paleontologists out there that will put on blinders and ignore the complete existence of some of these fossils because they're not in a public collection, even though they're important. And I don't think that's right either. So it goes both ways, us providing access and people accessing our collections as well. So, I mean, that's just basic stuff. That's what I had in mind. So that's about all I got. Did I go home? Not too bad.